Imagine it is September 14th, 2019. You are a 38-year-old schoolteacher living in Beirut, Lebanon. Your apartment is small but comfortable, on the third floor of a building in the Hamra neighborhood, with a view of rooftops and just a sliver of sea if you lean out the window on the right side. You have been saving for 11 years, not recklessly, carefully, methodically. Every month you put money aside in your bank account, a local bank that your father used, that his father used before him. The interest rate on your savings is 17% per year. 17. Which means your money is growing faster than most people in Europe or America could ever dream of. You feel, if you're being honest, quietly proud of yourself. You have a small car, you have savings, you have a plan. You tell your mother you will have enough to buy a place of your own within 4 years. She smiles and says, "You are smart. The economy is fine. The banks are strong. The government says so. The newspapers say so. The interest rate says so. Everything, by every visible measure, is pointing in one direction. Up." If you have ever wondered why the worst economic collapses in history are never predicted by the people living through them, stay with me. What you're about to hear is not a theory. It is a pattern that has repeated itself across different countries, different centuries, different governments, and different currencies. And every single time, the people caught inside it said the same thing afterward. We had no idea. But here's the truth. The signs were always there. They were just quiet. They were slow. And they were dressed up to look like prosperity. If that kind of historical clarity is valuable to you, subscribing to this channel takes 2 seconds, and it keeps you ahead of what most people never see coming. Because here is what that school teacher in Beirut did not know on that September morning in 2019. She did not know that her bank, and almost every bank in Lebanon, was not actually investing her savings. It was lending her money to the government. And the government was using that money to pay interest on older debt, which was borrowed to pay even older debt. She did not know that this had been going on since the early 1990s. She did not know that economists had been quietly writing reports about it for years. She did not know that the entire system had the structural integrity of a house of cards, in a room where the windows were slowly opening. She did not know any of this, because nobody told her. And 46 days later, the banks froze. She went to the ATM on a Tuesday morning in late October and was told she could withdraw $200, her own money, $200 per week. That was the beginning of what the World Bank would later call one of the worst economic depressions of the modern era. Not a war, not a natural disaster. A financial system collapse that had been quietly unraveling for years while everyone was told it was fine. And this video is about that, not about Lebanon specifically, about the mechanism, the pattern underneath every crisis that nobody sees until it is already too late. And about the uncomfortable truth that right now, today, versions of that same pattern are visible in the data if you know where to look. Before we go further, there is something important to understand about how economic crises actually work. Most people imagine a crisis like a car crash, sudden, violent, one moment normal, the next moment wreckage. But the historical record tells a completely different story. Almost every major economic collapse in the last 100 years looked, from the inside, like a gradual drift, a slow puncture, not a blowout. You're driving along, the tire feels fine, the radio is playing, the road is smooth, but somewhere underneath you, quiet and invisible, the air is escaping. And by the time you notice the car pulling to one side, you have already been driving on a flat for miles. The mechanism has a name among economists. It is called a Minsky moment, named after the economist Hyman Minsky, who studied it in the 1970s and 1980s. A Minsky moment is the point at which a financial system that has been quietly becoming more fragile suddenly breaks. But here's the key word. Suddenly. The moment of collapse feels sudden. The buildup almost never is. Minsky described it in 3 stages. First, people borrow carefully and can comfortably pay back what they owe. Second, slowly, people borrow more and can only pay the interest, not the actual debt itself. Third, people borrow to pay the interest on previous borrowing. That third stage is called Ponzi finance. Not because it involves a fraudster in a suit, but because the structure itself has become a scheme where you need new money coming in just to keep the old promises alive. When new money stops coming in, the structure does not bend. It breaks, all at once. From the outside, it looks like a sudden crash. From the inside of the data, it was visible for years. The rot was in the beams, not on the surface. And this brings us directly to the first case study in this pattern. Japan, 1989. In the late 1980s, Japan was the most admired economy in the world. Its companies were buying up American landmarks. Its banks were the largest on earth. Its stock market, the Nikkei, had been rising for 8 years in a row. Land prices in Tokyo were so high that the grounds of the Imperial Palace in central Tokyo were theoretically worth more than all the real estate in the state of California. People were not alarmed by this. They were proud of it, A 44-year-old bank manager in Tokyo in December 1989 would have felt, quite reasonably, that he was living through a golden age. His pension was invested in the market. His apartment had tripled in value. His bank was profitable and respected. On December 29, 1989, the Nikkei index hit its all-time peak at 38,957 points. 1 week later, the new decade had begun, and the slow unraveling started. By the end of 1990, more than $2 trillion had been wiped off the Japanese stock market. Land prices began to fall. Companies started reporting losses. And then came the thing that made Japan's collapse unique and particularly instructive for us today. The banks did not admit what was happening. They had lent enormous amounts of money to companies and developers whose assets were now worth far less than the loans. These are called non-performing loans, which simply means loans where the borrower cannot pay. What Japanese banks did, with the quiet tolerance of their government regulators, was pretend these loans were still good. They kept them on the books at full value. They called the companies still alive, even though the companies were economic ghosts, unable to grow, unable to invest, just barely able to service their debt. Economists gave these businesses a name that tells you everything. Zombie companies. Companies that were technically alive but economically dead, kept breathing only by the tolerance of banks that could not afford to admit the truth. Japan's GDP growth from 1991 to 2000 averaged just 0.5% per year. That is not a typo, 0.5% for a decade. Not a crash, not a panic, just a slow, grinding stagnation that stole a decade of growth from an entire generation. The bank manager from our story did not lose his job in a single dramatic moment. He watched his pension shrink. He watched his apartment value fall year after year. He watched his children struggle to find jobs in a labor market that had gone cold. He never woke up to locked bank doors. He just slowly watched the life he had planned drift further and further from reach. And the reason it lasted so long is precisely because the crisis was never allowed to announce itself. The problems were hidden, managed, suppressed. Authorities kept saying it was a temporary slowdown. They kept saying confidence would return. It did not for a decade, and arguably not for two. This leads us to the second part of this story. And here is something I want you to think about before we go further. If a government keeps telling you that a problem is manageable and keeps borrowing money to prove it, and keeps the system running on optimism instead of fundamentals, how would you know when that stops being a delay and starts being a deception? Drop your answer in the comments, seriously. Because what I am about to show you next is the part of this story that most people never hear, and it changes everything. Argentina, 1998 to 2001, a different country, a different era, but the same mechanism. Argentina in the late 1990s was, on paper, a model student. It had a currency board, which is a system where the peso was fixed exactly 1-to-1 with the US dollar. 1 peso equaled $1, always. Guaranteed. It was praised by international economists and financial institutions as a model of discipline. The International Monetary Fund called Argentina's position sustainable as late as the year 2000. The country was borrowing money, a lot of money. But the market believed in the peg, believed in the growth story, and kept lending. What was actually happening underneath that surface was a slow tightening of a financial vice. Argentina's total national debt reached approximately $132 billion by the end of 2001. Its interest payments were consuming an ever larger share of the national budget. The government was cutting spending, which slowed the economy, which reduced tax revenues, which increased the deficit, which required more borrowing, which added more interest, which required more cuts. This is a debt spiral. It moves slowly at first, then it moves faster, then it moves all at once. The ordinary people of Argentina did not know a debt spiral was underway. They saw unemployment. They saw their businesses struggling. But their dollar savings in the banks looked fine. The banks were operating. The peso was still 1-to-1 with the dollar. Argentina was still investment grade, according to the major rating agencies. On November 30th, 2001, President Fernando de la Rua signed a decree imposing what became known as the Corralito, a word that means small playpen. Bank withdrawals were capped at $1,000 per month, then later reduced even further. People who had spent their entire adult lives saving money inside the Argentine banking system discovered overnight that they could not get to it. The crisis did not start on November 30th. It had been building since at least 1998. But November 30th is the day ordinary people felt it. And by 2002, Argentina's economy had shrunk by nearly 11% in a single year. Public debt had risen from 62% of GDP to over 160% after the default and devaluation. The peso was severed from the dollar. People who had savings in dollars inside Argentine banks had those savings forcibly converted to pesos at government rates. Effectively, 2/3 of their dollar savings disappeared overnight. Not stolen in a dramatic heist. dissolved by a policy that the government presented as a necessary and temporary measure. This brings us directly to the third part of this story, Lebanon. And here is where history gets uncomfortable. Lebanon's financial crisis is one of the most instructive collapses of the 21st century, because it did not happen by accident. It happened by design. Or rather, it happened because of a structure that was designed to look sustainable while becoming less so every single year. After Lebanon's civil war ended in 1990, the country needed to attract foreign capital to rebuild. The solution was to offer extraordinarily high interest rates on deposits. Banks attracted dollar deposits from Lebanese living abroad, from Gulf investors, from international institutions. These dollars flowed into the commercial banks. The commercial banks then deposited them with the central bank, the Banque du Liban, at even higher interest rates, sometimes exceeding 20%. The central bank used those dollars to stabilize the Lebanese pound and to lend to the government. The government used the money to fund its operations and to pay interest on its own debt. And here's the circular trap. The interest payments on the government's debt went back to the central bank, which paid the commercial banks, which paid the depositors, who then redeposited to earn the next cycle of interest. As long as new deposits kept coming in, the wheel kept turning. The World Bank and multiple economists described this in exact terms. It was a Ponzi scheme, not a metaphor, a structural Ponzi scheme running at the scale of a national economy with the central bank at its center. For years, depositors were delighted. Your savings were growing at 17, 18, sometimes 20% per year. By Lebanese standards, the economy was functioning, the system was working. Between 2016 and 2019, however, the inflows of new foreign capital began to slow. The wheel needed new deposits to keep spinning. The new deposits were not coming in at the required pace. By September 2019, the central bank's foreign currency reserves were being depleted rapidly. On October 17, 2019, the Lebanese government announced a plan to tax WhatsApp calls. Protests erupted. Banks closed for 2 weeks. When they reopened, informal capital controls had been imposed. The school teacher from our opening could suddenly access only $200 per week of her own money. 6 months later, she could access even less. A year later, her savings in Lebanese pounds, converted at unfavorable rates, had lost over 80% of their real value. Lebanon's economy contracted by approximately 58% over the following 3 years. To put that in context, the United States economy during the Great Depression of the 1930s contracted by roughly 27% over 4 years. Lebanon lost more than twice that in peacetime. The World Bank called it deliberate depression, a crisis caused not by war, not by natural disaster, but by decades of a financial structure that was quietly unsustainable and publicly presented as a model. Now observe what all three of these cases have in common. Most people will never know what you now know. Most people will keep hearing that current debt levels are manageable. Most people will keep reading that the economy is fine, that growth is coming, that the system is working. If you are still here, you are not most people. Hit subscribe, because what comes next is the part this channel was made for, the part they never put in textbooks. Japan, Argentina, Lebanon. 3 completely different countries, 3 completely different political systems, 3 completely different cultures and histories, and yet the mechanism is identical in all 3 cases. In each case, debt was accumulated gradually over years, even decades. In each case, the accumulation was visible in the data, but explained away as manageable or temporary. In each case, the financial system developed structural weaknesses that were hidden, suppressed, or denied by the institutions meant to monitor them. In each case, credit rating agencies and international financial institutions continued to give positive assessments until very close to the moment of collapse. In each case, ordinary middle-class people with savings in the banking system bore the sharpest losses, and in each case, the moment of collapse was described in real time as a sudden and unexpected crisis. When the data, reviewed afterward, showed it was anything but sudden, it was a river changing course, not a flood. Rivers do not change course overnight. They find small new channels. They widen them slowly. They move a little more water through the new path each season. And then one year, you look up and the old riverbed is dry. This brings us to what this pattern looks like on a human level, because history is not made of graphs. It is made of people. In Japan, the people who felt the lost decade most deeply were not the wealthy and connected. They were the middle class, the salary workers who had faithfully paid into pension funds that were now invested in a stagnant stock market. Young people who graduated into a frozen job market in the early 1990s and spent a decade trying to find stable employment. Many never did. This generation became known in Japan as the lost generation. By some estimates, between 1.5 and 2 million Japanese workers who entered the labor market between 1993 and 2005 were effectively locked out of stable full-time employment. Not because they lacked skills or effort, but because they were trying to enter a system that had quietly closed its doors. Their parents had built savings, their parents had pensions, but those pensions were invested in assets that were worth far less than the account said. The account still showed the old numbers. The real value had already drained away. It is a specific and cruel kind of poverty. The kind where the numbers still look right, but the purchasing power has gone. In Argentina, the damage was swift and surgical in the worst sense. The peso's devaluation in January 2002, after the Corralito, destroyed the purchasing power of ordinary Argentinians with terrifying speed. The poverty rate, which had been around 35% before the crisis, rose to over 54% by October 2002. More than half the population below the poverty line. In under a year, small business owners who had taken out dollar loans to invest in their shops found themselves suddenly owing far more in peso terms than their entire businesses were worth. Thousands of businesses closed. The middle class, which had been the pride and engine of Argentine society for generations, was effectively gutted in 18 months. The people who came through it with the least damage were those who had kept dollars in cash outside the banking system or who had assets abroad. The people with foreign bank accounts, the people with property in Miami or Madrid. In other words, the people who had quietly moved some of their resources out of the system that failed. And in Lebanon, the story is still unfolding. As of the mid-2020s, the Lebanese pound had lost over 90% of its pre-crisis value. The healthcare system, already strained, deteriorated sharply. Doctors and engineers, people who had spent a decade building professional lives, emigrated in enormous numbers. The brain drain, which is the name for the departure of educated and skilled workers, became so severe that it itself became a crisis on top of a crisis. Those who stayed, mostly those who could not leave, faced a daily economic reality that was unrecognizable compared to 5 years earlier. And here is the cruelest part. Many of them had done everything right. They had saved, they had worked, they had trusted the institutions, and those institutions failed them, not dramatically, not all at once, slowly, quietly, and then completely. And the question is not whether this pattern will repeat. History has already answered that. The only question is whether you will see it before it sees you. Right now, today, global public debt has reached $102 trillion, a record high according to the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. Global total debt, including government, corporate, and household debt, reached $348 trillion at the end of 2025, according to the Institute of International Finance. That is a number almost too large to comprehend. To put it differently, it represents roughly 331% of global GDP. Which means the world as a whole owes more than 3 times what it produces in an entire year. In the United States, office property loans showed a delinquency rate of nearly 12% by late 2025, a record level. The commercial real estate sector, particularly office space following the shift to remote and hybrid work, is under structural pressure that has not yet worked through the banking system. Many smaller and regional banks hold concentrated exposure to this sector. The adjustment process, if history is any guide, does not happen cleanly or quickly. And the pension systems of most developed countries are running actuarial deficits, which means they have promised more to future retirees than they currently have assets to pay. The gaps are not small. If this channel helps you think differently about the world you live in, subscribe. It costs nothing, and it might change everything. So what did the people who came through these historical crises, relatively intact, actually do differently? The historical record on this is surprisingly consistent across very different times and very different places. The first characteristic, shared by those who navigated these crises better than most, is that they did not keep all of their wealth in one system or one form. In Weimar Germany, in the years between 1919 and 1923, as prices rose 50% per month, the people who retained economic standing were largely those who held tangible assets. Farmers who owned land, business owners who owned equipment and inventory, people with gold or with assets denominated in foreign currencies that were not being destroyed. The people who were most completely ruined were the middle-class savers with bank accounts in marks. Their savings evaporated not because the banks failed, but because the currency itself became worthless. The marks were still there. The number in the account still existed. It just bought nothing. By November 1923, the exchange rate had gone from approximately 4 marks per dollar in 1914 to 4 trillion marks per dollar. 4 trillion. A wheelbarrow of banknotes to buy a loaf of bread is not an exaggeration. It is a documented historical fact, and it did not happen overnight. It built for 4 years, while the government kept printing money and calling the problem temporary. The second characteristic shared by those who fared better is that they maintained the ability to produce something of direct, tangible value. In Argentina in 2001, it was farmers who could grow food and sell it in a market that had partially reverted to barter. Tradespeople, people with physical skills, not exclusively, but disproportionately. The third characteristic is that they paid close attention to the early signs of currency debasement, which means the quiet erosion of what money is actually worth. long before the official announcement of a crisis. In Lebanon, there were economic researchers publishing warnings about the sustainability of the system as far back as 2017 and 2018. In Argentina, there were economists warning about the debt spiral by 1999. In Japan, there were reports inside the Bank of Japan as early as 1992 acknowledging the scale of bad debt on bank balance sheets. The warnings existed. They were just not loud. They were not on the front page. And they were never confirmed by the official voices that people trusted most. Now, let us come back to where we started. September 2019, Beirut. The schoolteacher in the Hamra apartment with the sliver of sea view. What happened to her? She is not a fictional character. She is a composite of hundreds of thousands of Lebanese who went through what economists at the World Bank called deliberate depression. By 2021, she was likely earning a salary that, in real purchasing power terms, was worth less than a tenth of what it was 2 years earlier. The savings she had accumulated over 11 careful years were either frozen in an account she could barely access, or had been eaten alive by the collapse of the pound. The plan to buy an apartment was gone, not delayed, gone. The bank her father used, and his father used, was operating under informal capital controls that may never fully lift. She did not make a mistake. She did not take a risk. She trusted a system that was quietly failing long before anyone told her. That is the nature of the crisis that nobody sees. It does not announce itself. It does not arrive with sirens. It shows up as a slow change in what your money buys, as interest rates that feel oddly generous for reasons you cannot quite explain, as news stories about debt levels that seem too abstract to be relevant to your daily life, as experts saying the situation is manageable, as the same reassurances, in slightly different languages, that have preceded every major collapse in the historical record. And the historical record does not predict the future. No one can do that. What it does is identify patterns. And the pattern right now, across multiple data points in multiple countries, rhymes with what came before. Not perfectly. Patterns never repeat perfectly, but recognizably. And the people who recognized the pattern early, in Japan and Argentina and Lebanon and Germany, who quietly moved some of their resources outside the most exposed parts of the system, who diversified, who reduced their dependence on a single institution or a single currency, who paid attention when the official story and the data told two different stories. Those people came through in better shape than those who trusted the reassurances until it was too late. This is historical observation. It is educational analysis. It is not financial advice. Every situation is different. Every country is different. Every individual circumstance is different. Before making any financial decision of any kind, please consult a qualified professional who understands your specific situation. That disclaimer is not a formality. It is genuinely important. But what is also genuinely important is this. The understanding of history is not a luxury. It is not something for economists and academics. It is the single most powerful tool any ordinary person has for navigating a world that is more financially complex and more interconnected, and therefore more fragile than at any point in recorded history. The schoolteacher in Beirut deserved to know what the economists knew. She deserved access to the pattern. She deserved this information before October 2019, not after. This channel exists to give people that. One video at a time. This video is not for everyone. Most people will scroll past it. Most people will trust that the number in their account is a reliable picture of their financial reality. But if one person in your life needs to hear this, share it with them. Not because it will change the world, because it might change their world. Subscribe for more, and I will see you in the next one.